The rain in Bath was persistent, the kind of October drizzle that seemed determined to seep into the fabric of clothing, no matter how tightly one wrapped oneself. Violet Chen had learned, over her 24 years, that rain was simply an inconvenience to be managed rather than resented. Her small flat above the Seamstress shop on Pulteney Street was warm enough, her work was steady, and she had cultivated a life of such careful equilibrium that nothing seemed capable of disrupting it. That was before the stranger appeared with a torn evening coat and an expression of such profound distraction that he walked directly into her open doorway without seeming to notice she was standing there. "Pardon," he said, stepping back with the automatic courtesy of a man trained to manners from birth, though his eyes remained somewhat distant, focused, Violet thought, on something that existed neither inside her shop nor outside upon the rain-soaked street. "No harm done, sir," Violet replied, allowing the professional portion of her mind to assess his coat with the speed of a woman who had examined thousands of garments. Expensive, quality cut, approximately 5 months old, though the wear pattern suggested it had been subjected to considerably more stress than a typical coat received. The tear suggested not careless damage, but rather something that had caught and held, a fence perhaps, or the arm of a doorway during what must have been an emotionally complicated exit. "I am in need of a seamstress," the man said, holding up the coat as though presenting evidence of a crime. "I have torn this coat in a particularly unfortunate manner, and I find that I lack the skills necessary to repair it myself. My valet is currently engaged in managing various complications of relocation, and I find myself without resources. I can certainly assist you, sir," Violet said, extending her hand to accept the coat. "Though I must ask, are you residing in Bath?" "I have taken a house here," the man replied, beginning the process of extracting himself from the coat while maintaining propriety through the careful positioning of his body. "I find that Bath suits my temperament at this particular moment in my existence. Quiet, undemanding, unlikely to subject a man to the constant scrutiny of society. A man in hiding," Violet's mind noted with the precision that years of observation had cultivated. "A man who wishes to be forgotten, or at the very least, unrecognized." "I can have this repaired for you within 3 days, sir," she said, already envisioning the work. "Though if I may be so bold, I would suggest that you have it reinforced during that repair. The wear on this garment suggests a life being lived with considerable intensity." The man looked at her then, truly looked at her, and Violet saw his eyes shift from whatever distant landscape they had been occupying to the present moment. For a second, she observed his face with the clarity of someone viewing a photograph, aristocratic features, expensive tailoring partially obscured by neglect, eyes that were green-gray and profoundly sad. "You are observant," he said finally. "I find that most people do not observe. They look, but they do not see." "I am a seamstress, sir," Violet replied. "My livelihood depends upon observation. Fabric speaks to those who listen carefully." "What does my coat tell you?" he asked, and there was a quality to the question that suggested genuine curiosity rather than casual conversation. Violet held the coat up to the light filtering through her shop windows, allowing the fabric to speak to her in the language she had learned to interpret. "It tells me," she said slowly, "that you have lived through something that required you to grip this garment as though it might anchor you to something solid, that you have worn this coat through significant emotional upheaval, that you are currently attempting to construct a life of deliberate simplicity as penance for having lived a life of complex difficulty." There was a moment of profound silence. The man's expression did not change, but Violet saw something flicker behind his eyes, recognition of a truth that he had not anticipated being perceived by a stranger. "You are either extraordinarily intuitive," he said, "or extraordinarily presumptuous." "Perhaps both, sir," Violet replied. "In my experience, observation is often mistaken for presumption when it reveals truths that people prefer to remain hidden." "What is your name?" he asked. "Violet Chen, sir," she replied. "I am the proprietor of this establishment, and you are?" "Mr. Julian," he began, then seemed to reconsider the name he had been about to offer. "Julian Harmon. That is, my name is Julian Harmon, currently." "Currently," Violet noted. "Not formally, not previously, but currently, as though the name is temporary, as though he is uncertain how long he will inhabit it." "I shall have your coat repaired within 3 days, Mr. Harmon," Violet said, allowing the irregularity to remain unexamined. "Shall I send it to your residence, or will you collect it from here?" "I shall collect it," he replied, then paused. "That is, if it would not be intrusive to visit again." Violet understood that he was asking something that existed beneath the surface of the question. He was asking whether it would be acceptable for him to create a reason to return. He was asking whether a woman of her station would permit a man of what she suspected was his rank to develop a genuine acquaintance based on something other than formality. "I am here each afternoon from 2 until 6, Mr. Harmon," she said. "I often have tea at 4 o'clock. Should you wish to collect your coat, I can offer you refreshment as well." The relief that crossed his face was brief but absolute. "Then I shall certainly collect the coat, Miss Chen," he said. "I shall see you in 3 days." After he had departed, Violet sat alone in her shop with the torn coat draped across her workbench, and she allowed herself the luxury of genuine concern. She had seen something in this man's eyes that suggested a profound breaking that had not yet fully healed. She had seen the kind of pain that existed in permanent residence rather than as a temporary visitor. And despite the careful boundaries she had constructed around her life, despite her absolute commitment to remaining invisible and protected, Violet found herself hoping that he would indeed return in 3 days. That was, she thought with some alarm, the first threat to her equilibrium that she had encountered in years. He arrived precisely at 4 o'clock on the 3rd day, and he brought flowers. They were simple flowers, autumn asters in shades of purple and gold, the kind of flowers that could be purchased from any street vendor without drawing attention, but their simplicity was what made them significant. He was not attempting to declare anything grand or impossible. He was simply offering an acknowledgement that he was pleased to have a reason to return. "I have completed your coat, Mr. Harmon," Violet said, retrieving the carefully wrapped garment from where she had stored it. "I reinforced the tear with a secondary seam, and I took the liberty of examining the entire coat for weak points. The hem was beginning to fray at the edges of the left pocket. I have corrected that as well." "You are thorough," he observed, unwrapping the coat with the careful attention of someone who understood the value of meticulous work. He examined the repairs with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. "This is exceptional work, Miss Chen. I confess that I expected repair. This is something approaching restoration. A coat that is well made deserves to be preserved," Violet said. "It would have been wasteful to do less." She had prepared tea, as she did each afternoon, and she found herself retrieving a second cup without requiring him to ask. He settled into the chair across from her work table with the movement of someone who was learning, gradually, to trust that chairs would support him. "You are not originally from Bath," he said. It was not a question. "No, sir," Violet replied. "I am from London originally. My father was Chinese, my mother was British. I worked in service in a great house for several years before establishing myself here." She offered the information carefully, understanding that he was asking something that extended beyond simple geography. He was asking about her past, her origins, whether she came from a background that would make his return to her shop socially acceptable. "In what capacity did you work?" he asked. "As a seamstress within the household," Violet replied. "I managed all of the sewing requirements for the family and their guests. It was detailed work, but it provided me with both income and the independence to establish my own business." "And were you content in that work?" Julian asked. It was such an unexpected question that Violet took a moment to formulate an answer. Most people did not ask whether she had been content. Most people assumed that service work was simply something one endured. "I was," she said finally. "Though contentment and fulfillment are not the same thing, I was content in the work, but I was not fulfilled in my life. I was invisible by design, and while invisibility provided safety, it also provided isolation." Julian looked at his tea with the expression of someone examining something that might contain answers to questions he had been asking himself. "I sought invisibility deliberately," he said quietly. "I came to Bath specifically to become unnoticed, to reconstruct a life in which nobody knew who I was or what I had done, and I discovered that invisibility, when chosen, is considerably more isolating than I had anticipated." "Then perhaps," Violet suggested carefully, "the two forms of invisibility are not so different. Both leave one fundamentally alone." "Yes," Julian agreed. He looked at her directly then, and Violet felt something shift in the careful architecture of her emotional boundaries. They are precisely the same thing. He visited her shop regularly after that. Not every day. He was cautious, and he understood propriety well enough to know that daily visits from an unmarried man to an unmarried woman would generate gossip. But 3 times weekly, at 4 o'clock, he would appear with some excuse that both of them understood was unnecessary. Sometimes it was a cravat that required adjustment. Sometimes it was stockings that needed mending. Sometimes it was simply a coat that he had decided should be examined for potential damage before it occurred, and each time Violet would prepare tea, and they would sit in her small shop while the Bath afternoon faded into evening, and they would conduct conversations of increasing depth and significance. He told her about his first marriage, carefully without the graphic details that would have made the conversation inappropriate, but with enough honesty that Violet understood the essential truth of it. He had married a woman who did not honor the commitment they had made to each other, and he had, in his way, failed to provide her with whatever it was that had made infidelity seem preferable to fidelity. She told him about her parents, about her British mother who had scandalized her family by marrying a Chinese merchant, about her father's death when she was young, about the poverty that had necessitated service, about her mother's quiet sacrifices that had never been acknowledged. "Why did you remain invisible?" Julian asked one afternoon in November, as the light through her shop windows turned golden and ineffably sad. "You are intelligent. You are capable. You could have demanded more from life." "Invisibility provided safety," Violet replied, "and I am Chinese in a country where that is viewed as exceptional at best and suspicious at worst. Remaining invisible meant that nobody questioned my right to exist. To demand more would have required drawing attention, and attention brings judgment." "And are you content to remain invisible forever?" Julian asked. Violet considered the question with the seriousness that it merited. "No," she said finally. "I have discovered that I am considerably less content with invisibility now than I was before. You have made invisibility seem like a wasted existence." Julian reached across the space between them and took her hand, the first physical contact between them that transcended the formal courtesies of their society. "I have an extraordinary confession to make," he said, and Violet felt her heart accelerate. "I have arrived at the point in my life where I am no longer capable of maintaining my own invisibility, and I am wondering whether you might be willing to abandon yours." "What are you asking, sir?" Violet asked, though she understood perfectly well. "I am asking," Julian said, "whether you would consent to marry me. Not because it is convenient or because it is socially appropriate, because it decidedly is not the latter, but because I have discovered that the only form of visibility that matters to me is the visibility that exists in your presence. Because you see me completely, and instead of being horrified by what you see, you treat my brokenness as though it were simply another fabric requiring careful repair." Violet should have said no. She should have understood that a marriage between a mysterious man hiding under an assumed name and a woman of mixed heritage would be a scandal. She should have recognized that whatever Julian Harmon actually was, marrying him represented a step into the light from which she had spent her entire life hiding. Instead, she said yes. They were married quietly in the parish church of Bath, with none of the fanfare that would have accompanied the marriage of someone of Julian's actual rank, which, as it happened, was extraordinarily high. The vicar performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity, seemingly unaware that the man standing before him was neither the modest widower that his appearance suggested, nor the individual named Julian Harmon that he was officially marrying under. Violet signed the register with a hand that was steady, despite the extraordinary upheaval that her life was currently experiencing. She was now Mrs. Julian Harmon. She was married to a man whose real name she did not know. She was married to someone whose history remained partially obscured by deliberate misdirection. It should have been terrifying, and it was. But it was also, Violet discovered, exhilarating in a way that her careful, invisible existence had never been. Their wedding night took place in the house that Julian had rented, a pleasant property in the heights of Bath that was sufficient without being ostentatious. He did not attempt to consummate the marriage immediately. Instead, he simply held her while she slept, his arms around her carefully, as though she was something that might disappear if he did not remain completely present. "I am going to tell you everything," he whispered in the darkness, though she was already sleeping. "I am going to reveal every lie, every hidden element, every reason that I deserve far less than what you have given me. And I am going to do so because you deserve to understand exactly what you have married." The revelation came gradually, over the course of their first weeks together. It began with the arrival of correspondence addressed to Lord Julian Whitmore, which created a moment of confusion until he explained that Harmon was his mother's maiden name and that he had used it specifically to escape the weight of his actual identity. It expanded when she discovered that the house they rented was owned by someone who seemed to know him with a deference that went far beyond the landlord-tenant relationship. It culminated on a November afternoon when there was a knock at the door from a gentleman of such evident authority and distinction that Violet understood immediately that something significant was occurring. "Lord Julian," the gentleman said, and Violet realized she was hearing Julian's actual title for the first time. "I have received word from your uncle that your situation has evolved." After the gentleman, who was apparently some form of legal advisor, departed, Julian sat in their parlor with an expression of such profound resignation that Violet understood what he was about to explain. "I am the heir to the dukedom of Asherstone," he said flatly. "My uncle, the current duke, is aging and childless, which means that eventually the title will pass to me. When I married you, I was attempting to escape that destiny. I was not intending to bring you into a situation of such extraordinary complication." Violet took a moment to absorb this revelation. The man she had married, the man whom she had believed was a broken widower of modest means, was actually the heir to one of England's great peerages. "Did you know," she asked carefully, "that I worked in service for the Asherstone household approximately 5 years ago?" Julian's face went very still. "No," he said slowly. "No, I did not." "Are you suggesting that you know me, or have encountered me before?" "I worked as a seamstress at Asherstone House," Violet confirmed. "You were never there during my tenure. You had already withdrawn, but I remember extensive conversations with Miss Constance about her brother, about the brother who was suffering, about the brother who her mother believed was dying slowly because of his wife's infidelities." Understanding seemed to crash over Julian like a wave. "You were there," he said. "You were in my family's house, and you witnessed the preparations for my brother-in-law's funeral, and you never revealed this." "I did not believe it was relevant," Violet replied, "and more significantly, I did not wish to marry someone who felt obligated to marry me because I represented a familiar element of his past. I wished to marry someone who chose me freely, without the complication of prior connection." Julian rose abruptly, and Violet prepared herself for the anger that such a revelation might inspire. But when he turned to her, his expression contained not anger, but something approaching despair. "You have married me under false pretenses," he said. "You have agreed to a marriage to someone whose identity was deliberately concealed, and now you are revealing that you possessed knowledge of my history that you deliberately withheld. We have built our entire marriage on deception." "Yes," Violet agreed calmly, "we have. And perhaps we should be grateful that our deceptions align so precisely that we deserve each other absolutely." The letter arrived in December, carried by a messenger of such evident authority that Violet understood immediately that something was occurring in the external world that would inevitably impact their carefully constructed life in Bath. It was addressed to Lord Julian Whitmore, heir to the dukedom of Asherstone, and it bore the seal of Asherstone House itself. Julian opened it with hands that were entirely steady, read it with eyes that grew progressively more distant, and then set it down on the table between them with the care of someone placing something that might detonate. "My uncle is dying," he said without inflection. "He has been diagnosed with a condition that the physician estimates will render him incapacitated within 6 months. Upon his death, I will become the Duke of Asherstone." Violet felt something shift in her understanding of her future. "And how do you feel about that?" she asked. "I feel," Julian said slowly, "that I have inadvertently trapped you in a life of considerably greater complication than either of us anticipated. I came to Bath to escape the responsibilities of my title, and instead I have married a woman and managed to secure my future anyway. Now I must return to London, assume the identity I fled, and expose you to all of the scrutiny and judgment that comes with being the wife of someone of my rank. Perhaps," Violet suggested carefully, "you should explain to me exactly what complication you believe this presents." "You are the daughter of a Chinese merchant and a British woman," Julian said, and Violet heard the bitterness in his voice. "You are the product of a union that society views as fundamentally inappropriate. You worked in service. You are not in any measure what society would expect the wife of the Duke of Asherstone to be." "No," Violet agreed, "I am not, and society is welcome to view that however it wishes. But I have a question for you, Julian. Did you marry me to escape your responsibilities, or did you marry me because you love me?" "The latter," Julian said immediately. "I married you because you are the only person in my life who has seen my actual self and not flinched." "Then perhaps," Violet replied, "we should stop allowing anticipated judgment to determine our actions. Perhaps we should return to London, and you should assume your title, and I should become the Duchess that I apparently am, and we should allow society to manage its own shock." "They will be vicious," Julian said. "They will question your background." They will invent stories about how you seduced me into marriage. They will attempt to manipulate you into behaving in ways that are more acceptable to their narrow understanding of propriety. I have been invisible my entire life, Violet replied. I have no attachment to remaining so. If becoming visible as the wife of a duke is the cost of marrying you, then it is a cost I am willing to pay. Julian moved to her and drew her close, and Violet felt him trembling with something that might have been gratitude, or might have been fear, or might have been both simultaneously. I love you, he said. I need you to understand that completely. I love you not as an escape from my responsibilities, but as the reason that my responsibilities suddenly seem manageable. And I love you, Violet replied, not as a fantasy, but as a person. All of your complications and your deceptions and your broken places, I love all of it. The decision was made that evening. They would return to London after Christmas. Julian would formally assume his identity as the heir to the Duke of Asherstone. Violet would become the Duchess-to-be, and they would face whatever consequences society deemed appropriate for their union. It was a decision that would transform everything. The townhouse in Mayfair was precisely what Violet had expected, grand, intimidating, owned by people who expected the world to conform to their understanding of propriety. She had not expected the visceral reaction to seeing it again, because she had in fact been here before. 5 years ago, when she was the invisible seamstress working in the nursery wing, she had observed the architecture of this house with the eye of someone who understood that great houses contained both beauty and cruelty simultaneously. Julian watched her carefully as she moved through the rooms. You remember it, he said. It was not a question. I remember the conservatory where I repaired Miss Constance's ball gown when it tore, Violet said. I remember the morning room where I delivered mended linens. I remember the servants' hallway where I first heard the whispers about you, about how tragic it was that such a promising young man had married someone so fundamentally unworthy of his attention. And how do you feel, Julian asked, about returning as the woman who is apparently even more fundamentally unworthy? I feel, Violet said carefully, that I should like to meet your family, and I should like them to understand that I have married you, not because I wish to elevate myself, but because I wish to marry you. The family dinner occurred 3 days after their arrival. Lady Helen Asherstone received them with courtesy that was absolutely impeccable and absolutely cold. Lord William Asherstone, the current Duke, observed Violet with the expression of someone examining an object that had been placed in his house by mistake, and Miss Constance Whitmore, Julian's sister, went very pale the moment she entered the dining room and saw them together. You are Miss Chen, Constance said, the statement hanging in the air like an accusation. You worked in this house 5 years ago. I remember you. Mother was furious that you were so talented that she considered offering you a permanent position. I was Miss Chen, Violet replied with perfect calm. I am now Mrs. Julian Whitmore. It is a significant improvement in circumstances. My God, Lord William said quietly. Julian, tell me that you have not married the very woman who worked in this house. Tell me that you have not created a situation of such extraordinary complication. I have married the woman I love, Julian said with a finality that suggested the subject was closed. Whatever complication that creates is mine to manage, not yours to judge. But we shall all manage it, Lady Helen said, and Violet heard steel underneath her courtesy. Because whether we approve or not, she is now our family. It was not a welcome precisely, but it was an acknowledgement that Violet's position, however unconventional, was secure. As the dinner progressed, Violet understood something that she suspected Julian did not fully comprehend. She had returned to this house not as a servant, but as someone of consequence. And while society might judge that consequence as inappropriate, what she did with that consequence was entirely within her control. She had been invisible for 24 years. She had no intention of remaining invisible now. The Asherstone House library was precisely as Violet remembered it, all dark wood and older leather, ceiling that disappeared into shadow, books arranged with the kind of precision that suggested they were less for reading and more for demonstrating wealth and refinement. It was here that Julian had asked her to meet him on the afternoon following the family dinner. His expression, when she entered, suggested that he had discovered something that he found profoundly troubling. I have been reviewing the records, he said without preamble. Documents relating to my first marriage, my wife's death, all of the circumstances that drove me into voluntary exile in Bath. And what have you discovered? Violet asked, settling into the chair across from him. I have discovered, Julian said slowly, that the narrative I have been maintaining for 5 years that Catherine died as a result of her own carelessness, that she was leaving the home of one of her lovers when her carriage overturned, is not entirely accurate. Violet felt something shift in her understanding of the man she had married. "Explain," she said. Julian withdrew a sheaf of documents from the desk drawer, handling them as though they might contain something toxic. "The investigation into her death was conducted by men who were sympathetic to my position," he said. "My uncle ensured that the official narrative served my interests, but there were inconsistencies. The carriage was not traveling at the speed that would have caused such a catastrophic accident. The route she was supposedly taking did not align with the location where her body was discovered." "Are you suggesting," Violet asked carefully, "that her death was not accidental?" "I am suggesting," Julian replied, "that there are profound questions about whether her death was accidental, deliberate self-harm, or something significantly darker that my family ensured would never be officially investigated." He stood and moved to the window, his posture conveying the weight of this revelation. "I have spent 5 years believing that I was responsible for my wife's death," he continued. "Not directly. I did not cause the carriage accident, but indirectly because my failure to provide her with the attention she craved, my inability to love her in the way she demanded, my judgment of her infidelities, all of these things contributed to a state of mind that might have made her reckless, or suicidal, or vulnerable to something worse." "And now?" Violet asked. "Now," Julian said, "I wonder whether I have been carrying guilt for circumstances that were fundamentally beyond my control, whether I have been allowing myself to be defined by a tragedy that I neither created nor could have prevented." Violet rose and moved to him, placing her hand on his back with a gentleness that belied the gravity of the conversation. "What does your sister say?" she asked. "I have not asked her," Julian replied. "I am not certain that I wish to know what she believes. Not certain that understanding her perspective will change the fundamental truth. Catherine is dead, and I spent 5 years in exile because I could not bear to examine the circumstances of her death too closely." "Then perhaps," Violet suggested, "we should ask her." The conversation with Constance occurred that evening in the conservatory, the room where plants were maintained in a state of artificial perfection, where nature was controlled and managed according to human preference. Constance listened to her brother's recitation of the documentary inconsistencies with an expression of such profound resignation that Violet understood the truth before Constance spoke it aloud. "Catherine took laudanum," Constance said quietly. "She deliberately took enough to ensure that her heart would stop. The carriage accident was incidental. The overdose was the actual cause of death." Julian's face went very white. "How do you know this?" he asked. "Because Catherine told me," Constance replied. "The night before she died, she told me that she could not bear the knowledge of your contempt, that she could not endure another moment of knowing that you viewed her with such profound judgment and disapproval. She said that she was going to end it, and she asked me not to inform anyone of her intention." "And you allowed her to—" Julian began, but Constance cut him off with a vehemence that was unusual for her. "I did not allow her anything," she said sharply. "I attempted to stop her. I tried to convince her to speak with Father, to seek help, to understand that her life had value, but Catherine was determined. And I was young. I was only 23, and I did not know how to prevent someone from executing their own death when they were sufficiently committed to it." Julian sank into one of the conservatory chairs as though his legs would no longer support his weight. "You have known this for 5 years," he said. "You have known that Catherine's death was suicide, and you have allowed me to believe that I was responsible." "I knew that you needed to believe something," Constance replied with surprising firmness. "I knew that you would not survive the knowledge that Catherine had deliberately chosen to end her life, that she had made that choice with full knowledge that you would blame yourself. It was a kindness, Julian. A lie, yes, but a necessary one." "It was not a kindness to allow me to spend 5 years in exile," Julian said. "It was not a kindness to let me believe that I had driven my wife to such desperation." "And what would have happened," Constance asked, "if you had known the truth? If you had understood that Catherine's decision to end her life was her own choice, not your responsibility? Would you have healed? Or would you have spent those 5 years tormenting yourself with the question of whether you could have prevented it?" Julian did not answer, and in his silence, Violet understood something crucial. Constance was right. The truth, in this case, was not healing. The truth was simply a different form of torture. "I am sorry," Constance said finally, and her voice was small and broken. "I am sorry that I lied to you. I am sorry that I allowed you to suffer. But I am not sorry that you eventually found Violet. Because whatever else is true, you needed to escape that narrative. You needed to construct a new life unburdened by the weight of Catherine's despair. Julian looked at his sister with an expression of such profound complexity that Violet understood he was attempting to contain multiple incompatible emotions simultaneously. Anger at the deception, gratitude for the protection, understanding of the impossible position Constance had occupied, and the terrible recognition that sometimes lies do more good than truth. "I forgive you," he said finally. "I do not know if I should, but I do." That night in their bedchamber, Violet held Julian while he wept with the kind of grief that acknowledged not only Catherine's death, but the death of the narrative he had constructed to survive it. She held him while he grieved for 5 years of unnecessary guilt. She held him while he grieved for the wife he had been unable to love and the sister who had lied to protect him. And when his grief had exhausted itself, she whispered promises into the darkness. "You are not responsible for her death," she said. "You were not responsible for her choices. You were only responsible for the kindness or cruelty with which you treated her while she was alive. And whatever else is true, you were not cruel, Julian. You were simply human, incapable of providing the love she demanded because no one could have provided it. Her desperation was not your fault." Julian held her more tightly, and in that holding, Violet felt him beginning the process of releasing the weight of 5 years of unnecessary burden. The letter arrived on a grey January morning with the kind of formality that only death could impose. The current Duke of Ashestone, Lord William, had died at 3:30 in the morning, surrounded by his medical attendants and the knowledge that his time had come to an end. Julian received the news with a calmness that Violet found more troubling than any visible expression of grief might have been. He simply read the letter, set it aside, and continued taking his breakfast as though his entire life had not suddenly transformed. "Your Grace," Violet said quietly, "you may wish to acknowledge what has occurred." "I am aware," Julian replied, "that my uncle is dead. I am aware that I am now the Duke of Ashestone. I am aware that everything about my existence has just irrevocably changed." He set down his teacup with a precision that suggested considerable control. "I am also aware," he continued, "that approximately 100 decisions require my immediate attention, that there are estates to manage, tenants to address, political responsibilities to assume, that I have transformed from a man in voluntary exile to a man with extraordinary power and equally extraordinary obligation." "And are you prepared for that transformation?" Violet asked. "No," Julian said with absolute honesty, "but I suspect that neither of us was prepared for any of the transformations that have occurred since you entered my shop in Bath. Preparedness appears to be irrelevant to our continued forward motion." The funeral occurred on a surprisingly clear January afternoon, the kind of weather that felt inappropriate to the gravity of the occasion. Violet watched from the window as men of considerable importance arrived at Ashestone House, each one carrying the weight of political implication and social consequence. Julian, dressed entirely in black, received them with the formality of someone who understood that his role had transformed from grieving heir to powerful duke. Violet observed how his posture changed, how the way he held his body shifted to accommodate the weight of his new title. That evening, the solicitors gathered to address the transfer of title and the reading of the late Duke's will. Violet was not permitted to be present. It would have been inappropriate, but she sat in the morning room and attempted to engage with needlework, while her mind remained entirely focused on what was occurring in the library 2 floors above. When Julian emerged hours later, his expression was inscrutable. "The estate is more extensive than I anticipated," he said. "My uncle was extremely wealthy. There are properties I was unaware existed, investments in enterprises that would require a team of financial advisors to fully comprehend political influence in Parliament that I was not aware he possessed." "And does this complicate your position?" Violet asked. "It complicates everything," Julian replied. "It means that the decisions I make have impact that extends far beyond my personal circumstances. It means that I am now responsible for the welfare and prosperity of thousands of people across multiple counties. It means that my marriage to you, Violet, is no longer simply a matter of personal preference. It is now a matter of significant social and political concern." Violet felt something shift in her chest, a tightening that suggested the consequences of their union were about to become far more substantial than either of them had fully anticipated. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Do you regret marrying me now that you understand the complications your title brings to our union?" Julian moved to her and drew her close. his arms around her with the certainty of someone who had arrived at a fundamental decision. "I regret nothing," he said. "I regret the pain that our marriage may cause you. I regret the judgment that society will level against you. But I do not regret marrying you, Violet. You are the only clear thing in a life that has become extraordinarily complex. You are the only decision I have made in 5 years that I do not question." The formal investiture as Duke occurred 3 weeks later, in a ceremony of such elaborate ritual that Violet found it almost incomprehensible. Julian, dressed in robes of state, knelt before the Lord Chancellor and accepted titles and responsibilities that transformed him from Lord Julian to His Grace the Duke of Asheston. And when he rose from that kneeling position, he looked directly at Violet, positioned in the gallery with the rest of the family, and something passed between them that transcended formality. He had chosen her, not because she elevated his position, but because she grounded him in something real. That evening, after the official celebrations had concluded, Violet found him in the library, the room where all significant revelations in their relationship seemed to occur. "I have made a decision," Julian said without preamble. "I intend to use my position and resources to address some of the conditions that exist in my properties. The tenants deserve better housing. The workers deserve better wages. The villages deserve better schools and medical care. And you believe that the other members of the aristocracy will approve of such expenditure?" Violet asked. "I am certain they will not," Julian replied. "I am certain that they will view such expenditure as dangerously progressive, but I have discovered, Violet, that I no longer care what the aristocracy approves. I care about whether I can sleep at night knowing that I have used my power in service of something other than perpetuating my own comfort." Violet understood then that her marriage to Julian had not been designed to elevate her. It had been designed to transform him, to give him a reason to believe that he could be something other than the broken widower who had fled to Bath, seeking obliteration. She had married a man seeking invisibility. She had, through the quiet power of genuine love, created a man stepping deliberately into visibility and consequence. Society's reaction to the Duke of Asheston's marriage to a seamstress of mixed heritage occurred in waves of increasing viciousness. The first wave was simple dismissal. Violet was discussed at first with the kind of polite circumspection that suggested the entire situation was temporary, that the Duke would eventually recognize his mistake and remove the embarrassing woman from his life. The second wave was speculation about coercion. Did the Duke suffer from some form of derangement? Had he been subjected to manipulation? Was he engaged in some form of social experiment that would eventually be concluded? The third wave was character assassination. Violet was described as a temptress who had seduced a vulnerable man. She was portrayed as a woman of questionable virtue who had leveraged her position as a servant to access the Duke's chambers. She was characterized as someone who had deliberately calculated her entrance into aristocratic society. None of this was true. All of it was absolutely devastating. Violet discovered that invisibility, while isolating, was far more comfortable than visibility accompanied by systematic judgment. She discovered that being observed with intention is far more painful than being observed without awareness. By February, the whispers had become so pronounced that even strangers would stop and stare. Even children had begun to understand, through the reactions of their parents, that the Duchess was someone inappropriate, someone who did not belong. "I am destroying your position," Violet said one evening, after observing Julian navigate an entire room of his political peers who had suddenly become considerably less cordial in his presence. "I am creating complications that damage your ability to govern effectively." "You are doing nothing of the sort," Julian replied with the kind of firmness that suggested the question had been troubling him for some time. "What you are doing, Violet, is revealing the arbitrary nature of the aristocracy's judgment. You are demonstrating through your presence how easily respect can be withdrawn based on nothing other than the circumstance of one's birth. And are you prepared to sacrifice your political effectiveness because of principle?" Violet asked. "I am prepared to sacrifice considerably more than that," Julian said. "I did not reclaim my life from the wreckage of my first marriage simply to surrender it again to social judgment. If the aristocracy finds my marriage objectionable, then they can cease to associate with me. But I will not remove you from my life to make them more comfortable." The confrontation that fundamentally altered society's perception of the marriage occurred at a ball hosted by the Marchioness of Pemberton, a woman of such consequence that her opinion effectively determined social acceptability. Lady Pemberton, in the middle of the dancing, had turned to a nearby matron and made a comment about the extraordinary scandal of allowing such a woman to represent the dignity of an ancient dukedom. Julian, standing approximately 3 meters away, had heard every word. He had, before anyone could prevent him, walked directly to Lady Pemberton, bowed with perfect courtesy, and spoken with a clarity that silenced the immediate vicinity. "Madam," he had said, "I find your judgment of my wife to be not only incorrect but contemptible. My wife is a woman of extraordinary intelligence, moral courage, and genuine kindness, qualities that I can observe are somewhat lacking in your own character. I would suggest that you examine your own life before offering judgment on hers, and I would further suggest that you never again speak of the Duchess with anything other than the respect that her position, and more significantly, her character, merits." He had then turned and departed, leaving Lady Pemberton with her mouth open and the entire room observing the exchange. The consequences were immediate and severe. Lady Pemberton's reputation suffered considerably. The other matrons who had been joining in the whispers suddenly became extremely cautious about their commentary, and slowly, incrementally, society's narrative began to shift. The Duke was not compromised by his marriage. He was devoted to his wife, and that devotion, apparently, was based on something other than social obligation or manipulation. It was based on genuine affection. That fact, which society had previously viewed as evidence of weakness, suddenly became viewed as evidence of extraordinary character. By March, Violet found herself invited to events, not because she had become acceptable, but because observing her had become fascinating. She was the woman who had captured the Duke's heart sufficiently that he was willing to defend her against social judgment. She was the woman who had transformed a broken man into someone capable of leadership. "I do not know whether I prefer the judgment or the fascination," Violet admitted to Julian one evening. "Neither is particularly pleasant," Julian agreed. "But fascination is considerably better than judgment. Fascination might eventually transform into genuine acceptance. Judgment never transforms into anything other than deeper judgment." He was right, of course. By April, Violet had begun to be invited to events with genuine warmth. By May, she had acquired friends, women who seemed to appreciate her intelligence and her refusal to pretend to be something other than exactly what she was. But the transformation had come at a cost. Violet now understood, in a way that her years of invisibility had not taught her, that visibility and safety were fundamentally incompatible. By stepping into the light, she had surrendered the protection that darkness provided. The question that emerged was whether the light and the man standing beside her within it was worth the loss of that protection. The answer, Violet discovered, was absolutely yes. It was Julian who first acknowledged the elephant that had been occupying their bedchamber since the night of their marriage in Bath. They had not consummated their union. "I have not pushed you," he said one evening in May as they prepared for sleep, "because I wished to ensure that you felt completely secure in your choice to remain married to me. But Violet, I must confess that I am approaching the limits of my restraint." Violet, who had been expecting this conversation for months, set down her brush and turned to face him directly. "I have not encouraged consummation," she replied, "because I wish to establish that my presence in your life was not contingent on my willingness to fulfill sexual obligation. But I also confess, Julian, that I have reached a point where I wish to move beyond that boundary." Julian moved to her, his movement careful as though he were approaching something that might startle. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Absolutely certain? Because I do not wish this to occur under any pressure whatsoever." "I am certain," Violet replied. "I have been certain for quite some time. I have been waiting for you to believe that you deserve this level of connection." What occurred that night was not the passionate, all-consuming encounter that romance novels depicted. It was something far more significant. It was an exchange of vulnerability that transformed intimacy from obligation into genuine connection. Julian approached her body the way he had approached her mind during their months in Bath, with careful attention, with genuine curiosity, with the understanding that her body was not something to be conquered, but something to be honored and explored. "Tell me if something causes you discomfort," he whispered, his hands moving with careful deliberation. "Tell me if you wish me to cease. Tell me exactly what you are feeling." "I feel safe," Violet replied. "I feel that I'm being truly seen by someone who does not view my body as something shameful or inappropriate. I feel loved." The physical act itself was less significant than the emotional honesty that accompanied it. When Julian entered her, It was with such tenderness that Violet felt tears slide down her cheeks. When they moved together, it was with the synchronization of two people who had already learned to read each other's emotional language and were now learning to read their physical language as well. Afterward, lying together in the darkness, Julian spoke of something that he had never previously articulated. "Catherine and I never achieved genuine intimacy," he said quietly. "We had relations, because that was expected, but we never achieved connection. I believe that was part of what drove her to seek comfort elsewhere. I could not give her what she needed, and she was too proud to acknowledge her own need until it destroyed her." "And can you give me what I need?" Violet asked. "I can try," Julian replied. "I can try every day to be present, to be attentive, to honor the choice you have made to remain in this marriage, despite the complications it creates. But more significantly, Violet, you have already given me what I needed. You have given me permission to believe that I deserve something other than self-condemnation." They made love again that night, and again it was not the performance of obligation, but the genuine expression of connection between two people who had chosen each other absolutely. By morning, something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. They were no longer two broken people finding comfort in each other's company. They were becoming partners, genuine partners in the construction of a life that transcended their individual histories. "I wish to tell you something," Violet said, as they took breakfast together. "I wish to tell you that I have been deeply afraid since we arrived in London, afraid of my inadequacy, afraid of my inability to fulfill the role of Duchess, afraid that you would eventually recognize your mistake in marrying me." "And are you still afraid?" Julian asked. "Yes," Violet admitted. "But the fear has become bearable because I understand that you are also afraid. We are both attempting to navigate a situation for which neither of us was genuinely prepared, and that mutual fear, paradoxically, makes me feel less alone." "You are not alone," Julian said with absolute certainty. "You will never be alone again, Violet. That is the promise I am making to you, not because I expect you to remain invisible, but because I choose to remain visible with you, whatever consequences that brings." By June, Violet had begun to understand that her position as Duchess was not a limitation, but rather an opportunity to exercise influence in ways that her years as a seamstress had never allowed. She began with the housing. The estate cottages that had been deteriorating for decades suddenly became the focus of intensive renovation. Roofs were replaced, chimneys were repaired, windows were installed where there had previously been only openings covered with cloth. The improvements were not for aesthetic purposes, but for survival purposes, protection from the elements that genuinely threatened the inhabitants' well-being. The workers on the estate, initially suspicious of the Duchess's involvement, gradually came to understand that her interest was not performative, but genuine. She visited the cottages. She observed the conditions. She asked questions that revealed she understood not only what was wrong, but why traditional repairs had proven insufficient. "You understand construction," one of the estate workers observed after watching her discuss reinforcement techniques with the builders. "I understand fabric," Violet replied. "I understand how material responds to stress, how it deteriorates, how it requires proper maintenance. Houses are constructed from materials that follow the same principles." She extended her influence to the schoolhouse, which had been operating with insufficient resources for years. New books were acquired. A teacher was brought from Bath, a woman of genuine educational sophistication rather than simply a person who could read. Learning materials were established, and perhaps most radically, Violet began to insist that girls receive the same educational opportunities as boys. "Your Grace," the estate manager said with visible discomfort, "this is approaching progressive thinking that the neighboring estates will find objectionable." "Then let them find it objectionable," Violet replied, with the certainty of someone who had already sacrificed everything for principle. "I did not survive invisibility simply to surrender to conventional limitations. If girls on this estate possess intellectual capacity, and they do, they deserve the opportunity to develop it." Julian observed her transformation with something approaching awe. He watched her move through Ashestone House with the confidence of someone who understood not only where she had come from, but precisely where she was going. He observed her handling of servants, respectful but firm, acknowledging their humanity while establishing clear expectations. "You are a remarkable Duchess," he said one evening, as they observed the village from the library window. "I am a seamstress who learned to be invisible," Violet replied. "Now I am learning to be visible. There is nothing remarkable about that. There is simply necessity and the willingness to act on it. By July, the changes had become so pronounced that neighboring estates began to inquire about the improvements. By August, other dukes were asking for advice about how they might implement similar projects without appearing excessively progressive. Julian, watching his wife systematically transform not only his estate, but the broader conversation about a duke's responsibility to his tenants, understood something crucial. He had not rescued her from obscurity. She had rescued him from self-condemnation by showing him that power could be exercised in service of something other than self-perpetuation. The letter arrived on a warm August afternoon, a letter that would fundamentally challenge everything they had constructed. It was from Eleanor Pemberton, the widow of the man with whom Catherine, Julian's first wife, had been engaged in her final affair. The letter contained documentation that Eleanor wished to discuss regarding the true circumstances of Catherine's death. Documentation that suggested Julian had been blamed for a tragedy that involved considerably more complication than anyone had previously acknowledged. Julian read the letter with an expression that Violet had learned to recognize as indicating significant internal upheaval. "She is writing," he said slowly, "because she believes that I deserve to understand the complete truth about my first marriage, and because she wishes to offer an apology for the role her late husband played in Catherine's despair." "Do you wish to meet with her?" Violet asked. "No," Julian replied. "I do not wish to revisit that chapter of my life. I have finally, with your help, achieved peace regarding what occurred with Catherine. I have no desire to reopen wounds that have only recently healed." He set the letter aside and looked at Violet with an expression of such profound gratitude that she understood the full weight of what he was expressing. "You have given me the ability to move forward," he said, "not by erasing my past, but by showing me that my past does not define my future. You have shown me that redemption is possible, not through grand gestures or public declarations, but through the quiet, daily choice to be better than one was yesterday." Violet moved to him and took his hand, and in that gesture existed an entire conversation about love and choice, and the extraordinary power of two people deciding to build something genuine from the wreckage of their individual histories. The letter from Eleanor Pemberton was filed away, unread, and Violet and Julian turned their attention back to the work of transforming Asherstone House from a monument to aristocratic tradition into something far more revolutionary, a place where power served purpose rather than preservation. August became September, and Violet discovered something that she had not anticipated with sufficient seriousness. She was pregnant. The knowledge arrived not with drama, but with the quiet persistence of a body communicating fundamental changes. The nausea in the mornings, the way certain foods that she had previously enjoyed now caused her genuine distress, the extraordinary fatigue that suggested her body was engaged in work that transcended ordinary experience. She did not tell Julian immediately. She spent 2 weeks observing the physical manifestations of pregnancy, attempting to understand whether this was something temporary or whether her life was about to transform in ways that she had not fully prepared for. "You are aware," Julian said one evening, his perceptiveness apparently transcending her careful concealment, "that I can observe you with considerable attention. I notice when you do not eat your breakfast. I observe when you excuse yourself from the drawing room with expressions suggesting physical discomfort. Tell me what is occurring." "I am pregnant," Violet said simply. "I discovered this approximately 10 days ago, and I have been attempting to determine whether I wish to acknowledge it." Julian's expression underwent a transformation that Violet found both beautiful and terrifying. It was not the expression of a man celebrating a socially appropriate development. It was the expression of a man confronting a fundamental shift in the architecture of his existence. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you experiencing complications?" "No complications," Violet replied. "Simply the disorientation of understanding that my body is no longer entirely my own, that I am now constructing another human being within myself, and that this construction will require sacrifice that I cannot yet fully comprehend." Julian moved to her and placed his hand on her still flat abdomen with a tenderness that suggested he was touching something sacred. "I love you," he said. "I love you, and I love this child that we have created together. I love the fact that you are choosing to remain in this marriage, despite the additional complication that this pregnancy creates." "I am not choosing despite the pregnancy," Violet corrected gently. "I am choosing because of it, because the pregnancy represents something that my years of invisibility could never have achieved. The creation of a new human being who will inherit not my servitude, but my strength. The announcement of the pregnancy occurred at a garden party hosted by the Asherstone family in late September. Violet, dressed in pale green that complemented her complexion, made the announcement not with formal ceremony, but with simple honesty as she moved through the gathering. "I am with child," she said to the assembled women of consequence. "The child should arrive approximately in April. I anticipate that this will be an extraordinary experience, and I find myself looking forward to it with considerably more enthusiasm than I anticipated." The response was remarkable. Rather than judgment, Violet encountered genuine warmth. The women who had spent months questioning her appropriateness suddenly became protective, offering advice, sharing their own experiences of pregnancy, treating her with the respect that her position as Duchess of Asherstone and expectant mother apparently commanded. Lady Constance, observing this transformation, pulled Violet aside with an expression of profound relief. "You have accomplished something remarkable," Constance said. "You have transformed yourself from an object of judgment into a woman of genuine consequence. The pregnancy is, paradoxically, the final element that society required to accept you completely." "Why is that?" Violet asked. "Why does the fact that I am bearing a child alter society's perception of my appropriateness?" "Because a woman bearing a child is fulfilling her most essential function," Constance replied. "And society, regardless of its other judgments, cannot dismiss a woman who is proving her ability to contribute to the continuation of their family line. You have given them exactly what they required, evidence that you are not simply occupying Julian's life, but constructing his legacy." It was not the most sophisticated reasoning, but it was accurate. By confirming that she was pregnant, Violet had proven her value according to society's standards. She was no longer simply the inappropriate woman who had married above her station. She was the woman who would bear the next Duke or Duchess of Asherstone. By October, the entire tone of her reception had altered. Invitations became more frequent. Offers of assistance with the nursery became more generous. Even the skeptics began to acknowledge, however grudgingly, that the Duchess appeared to be a permanent fixture in the Duke's life. Julian observed the transformation with something approaching dark humor. "Society will accept almost anything," he observed, "provided that it results in the continuation of aristocratic bloodlines. You could have been a criminal, and they would have forgiven you provided that you were capable of bearing a child." "Does that diminish your satisfaction with the pregnancy?" Violet asked. "Not at all," Julian replied. "It simply confirms my understanding that society's values are fundamentally arbitrary. What matters is that we have created something together that transcends society's judgment. What matters is that I love you completely, and that child will be raised with that knowledge as the foundation of its existence." As October progressed, Violet's body began to change with increasing visibility. The slight thickening of her midsection became unmistakable. Her gowns required progressive alteration to accommodate the new contours of her form, and perhaps most significantly, she began to experience the child's movement, the extraordinary sensation of another being existing within her body. The first time she felt the child move, she was alone in the conservatory, the room where she had first engaged in serious conversation with Julian in Bath, the room where plants were maintained in artificial perfection, the room that had become her sanctuary. The sensation was so subtle that she almost dismissed it as imagination, but then it occurred again, a flutter like a butterfly moving against the interior of her skin, and Violet understood with absolute clarity that she was no longer alone. She was never going to be alone again. She pressed her hand against her abdomen and whispered a promise to the child she was carrying. "You will be loved," she said, "completely, without reservation. Without the conditions that were placed on my own existence. You will know only that you are wanted, that you are valued, that your life has meaning from the moment of your conception." Julian, finding her there an hour later, sat beside her in silence. She took his hand and placed it against her abdomen, waiting for the moment when the child would move and he could share in the extraordinary sensation of knowing that their love had created something living and real. When the movement came, Julian went very still. "My God," he whispered, "it is real. The child is genuinely real." "It is real," Violet confirmed, "and it is changing everything." November brought with it the kind of grey, relentless weather that seemed to seep into the very walls of Asherstone House, but inside there was warmth, literal warmth from fireplaces burning constantly, and emotional warmth created by Julian's extraordinary devotion to Violet's expanding pregnancy. He had, without her requesting it, begun to educate himself extensively on the process of childbearing. Medical texts appeared in the library. He consulted with the physician who attended to Violet's care. He asked questions that revealed a depth of concern that transcended the ordinary solicitude a husband might provide. "I will not allow what occurred with my first marriage to repeat," he said one evening, as they sat before the fire in their bedchamber. "With Catherine, I was absent. I was focused on my own concerns, my own disappointments. I did not observe her actual needs. I will not make that mistake with you." "You are in danger of overcompensating," Violet observed gently. "Your presence is appreciated, Julian, but your obsessive attention to every aspect of my well-being is beginning to suggest anxiety rather than devotion." "I am terrified," Julian admitted. "I am terrified that something will go wrong. I am terrified that I will lose you. I am terrified that the child will be damaged somehow. I am terrified that I will fail in the most important endeavor of my life, the creation of a genuine family." Violet took his hand and placed it against her abdomen, where the child was moving with increasing frequency and force. "The child is strong," she said. "Feel how powerful the movement is. This is not a fragile being requiring extreme protection. This is a human being who is developing with vigor and intention. You need not be terrified, Julian. You need only be present." "I can be both terrified and present," Julian replied. As November progressed into December, Violet's pregnancy became the central focus of household activity. A nursery was prepared, not with the cold formality that was traditional, but with genuine consideration for comfort and functionality. Violet involved herself extensively in the selection of furnishings, insisting on practical considerations rather than merely aesthetic ones. "The child will spend considerable time here," she explained to the household staff. "It requires furniture that will serve the child's needs rather than the parent's desire for elegance." The cradle was constructed from pale wood that Violet selected personally. The bedding was created from the softest linen that could be sourced. The room was situated to catch maximum light during the day, while remaining warm during the winter months. And perhaps most significantly, Violet spent hours simply sitting in the nursery, her hand on her abdomen, imagining the child that would soon inhabit this space. Julian frequently found her there, silently communing with the pregnancy that was transforming her body and her life. "What are you thinking?" he would ask. "I am thinking," she would reply, "about what it means to create a life deliberately. I am thinking about the extraordinary responsibility of bringing into existence a human being who will inherit both my strength and your capacity for redemption. I am thinking about how profoundly everything will change." "Are you afraid?" Julian asked one such afternoon. "Terrified," Violet admitted, "but also extraordinarily hopeful. I spent my life in service to others, invisible to the world. This child will be visible. This child will be educated. This child will be given opportunities that I could never access, and that knowledge makes the terror bearable." By December, Violet's pregnancy had progressed to the point where simple activities required considerable planning and effort. Walking became a slow, deliberate process. Climbing stairs required rests at intervals. Even sleeping became complicated as the growing child demanded increasingly more space within her body. But rather than diminishing her presence, the pregnancy seemed to heighten it. Society, observing the visibly pregnant Duchess, began to treat her with a kind of reverence. She was not simply a woman, but a woman engaged in the sacred work of reproduction, the work that all of society depended upon for its continuation. "I find it remarkable," Violet observed to Julian, "that I am treated with greater respect now that I am visibly pregnant than I was before my condition became evident, as though my value increased the moment it became clear that I was carrying an heir." "Society values women primarily for their reproductive capacity," Julian replied with visible distaste. "It is one of the aspects of our civilization that I find most contemptible. But we can use society's prejudice to our advantage. We can ensure that our child is born into a world that has been forced to acknowledge your value, if only because you are bearing a Ravencroft heir." Christmas approached, and Violet experienced emotions of unexpected intensity. She had never truly celebrated Christmas. Her childhood had been marked by poverty, and her years in service had been consumed by work. But now, with Julian, with a child growing inside her, with a home that was genuinely hers, Christmas became something approaching sacred. The decorations of Asherstone House transformed the space into something approaching magical. Holly and ivy decorated the corridors. A massive tree was erected in the entrance hall. The servants were given time away from their duties to spend with their own families, and Violet found herself genuinely joyful in a way that her earlier life had not prepared her for. On Christmas Eve, Julian took her to the small family chapel, a space that Violet had not previously visited. It was decorated simply, with candles that created an atmosphere of profound peace. "I wanted to bring you here," Julian said, "to acknowledge something important. I wanted to confess before God and whatever spiritual forces might be observing us that you have saved my life, not metaphorically, literally. I came to Bath seeking obliteration, and you have instead given me redemption." They stood together in the candlelit chapel, Julian's hand on her abdomen where their child was moving, and Violet whispered a prayer of her own. "I pray," she said, "that this child will inherit Julian's capacity for transformation and my capacity for resilience. I pray that it will be raised in a world where love is genuine and unconditional. I pray that it will know always that it was wanted and is valued." That evening they made love with extraordinary tenderness, the first time since Violet's pregnancy had become pronounced. It was not motivated by passion, but by the profound need to express connection, to affirm that their bond transcended the physical transformations that pregnancy was creating. Afterward, as they lay together in the darkness, Julian spoke of something that had clearly been occupying his mind for considerable time. "I wish to write a letter," he said, "to be opened by the child when it comes of age. A letter that explains who you are, where you came from, and the extraordinary journey that brought us together. I wish the child to understand that it was born not from social obligation, but from genuine love." "That is a remarkable idea," Violet replied, "but I have a request. I wish to write a letter as well. I wish to tell our child my own story, so that it understands that invisibility is a choice, not a destiny. That regardless of the station into which one is born, one possesses the capacity to transform one's own existence." And so, in the remaining weeks before the child's arrival, both Julian and Violet wrote letters. Letters that would become treasured possessions. Letters that would explain to the next generation how love and determination could transform even the most damaged or constrained circumstances into something approaching grace. January arrived with a ferocity that suggested winter was not simply weather, but a fundamental force determined to test the limits of human endurance. The snow came in waves, creating drifts that isolated Asherstone House from the surrounding countryside. Violet, now in the 7th month of her pregnancy, was confined to the house, not by Julian's insistence, but by simple, practical necessity. The weather made traveling unsafe. The physician advised against unnecessary exertion. And Violet herself felt increasingly the weight of the life she was carrying, the extraordinary demands that the pregnancy was placing on her body. It was during this period of confinement that complications began to emerge. The first sign was subtle, a tightening across her abdomen that was different from the Braxton Hicks contractions that she had been experiencing for weeks. It was accompanied by a sense of pressure, of something not being quite aligned properly, of her body attempting to communicate something that required immediate attention. "I am concerned," she said to Julian one morning, after a particularly difficult night, "that something is not progressing correctly with the pregnancy." Julian's face went very white. He immediately summoned the physician, a man of considerable experience, but also considerable honesty about the limits of medical knowledge. "There is evidence," the physician said after a thorough examination, "of what is called a posterior presentation. Rather than the child positioning itself for delivery with the head down and backward, the natural presentation, it appears to be positioned with the head down but forward, facing toward the abdomen rather than toward the spine. This can create complications during labor. It can extend the length of labor considerably, and it increases the risk of injury to the mother." "What do you recommend?" Julian asked, his voice barely controlled. "We will monitor closely," the physician replied. "If the child turns naturally, which frequently occurs, there is no cause for concern. If it does not turn, we will need to assess, as labor progresses, whether the presentation creates complications sufficient to require medical intervention that carries its own risks." After the physician departed, Julian deteriorated with a rapidity that alarmed Violet. He stopped eating properly. He ceased attending to his duties as Duke. He spent entire nights sitting beside her bed, his hand touching her abdomen, as though he could physically communicate to the child that it needed to turn into proper position. "This is my fault," he said one evening, his voice hollow with despair. "I have created this situation through my need to marry you. I have placed you in danger through my selfishness. If something happens to you, if this pregnancy harms you, I will not survive it. Stop, Violet said firmly. Stop this spiral of self-condemnation immediately. You are not responsible for the position the child has assumed. You are not responsible for the medical complications that might arise. You are only responsible for being present and supportive, and you are failing in that responsibility by allowing your own anxiety to dominate. How can you be so calm? Julian demanded. How can you accept the possibility of genuine danger with such equanimity? Because, Violet replied, I have learned through my years of invisible existence that catastrophizing does not change outcomes. It only diminishes the present moment. Yes, there is risk. Yes, childbirth is inherently a situation of danger, but I refuse to surrender the remaining weeks of my pregnancy to terror. I refuse to allow fear to poison the time I have left before this child arrives. Julian seemed to absorb this, but his underlying anxiety did not diminish. If anything, his need to control the situation intensified. He hired additional physicians for consultation. He brought specialists from London to examine Violet. He became obsessive about ensuring that every possible complication was anticipated and prepared for. You are going to drive me to actual madness, Violet said finally, after he had attempted to prevent her from walking to the library, claiming that the exertion might trigger premature labor. Julian, I understand that you are afraid, but I cannot live my remaining pregnancy confined to a single room while you obsess about every possible complication. I cannot lose you, Julian said simply. I cannot bear the thought of losing you. Then support me in remaining present, Violet replied. Support me in living my life as fully as possible, given my current state. But do not attempt to control the uncontrollable. Do not attempt to prevent every possible danger. Do not allow your love for me to become a prison. Slowly, with considerable effort, Julian began to retreat from his obsessive monitoring. He began to allow Violet to move through the house as she wished, provided that she remained safe. He began to accept that he could not control the outcome of the pregnancy through sheer force of will, and in that acceptance, something shifted. His anxiety began to transform into something approaching peace, not because the risk had diminished, but because he had begun to accept that risk was simply an inherent component of loving someone deeply. In mid-February, when the child finally turned into proper presentation, Julian wept with a relief so complete that it suggested he had been holding his breath for weeks. It is moving, he said, his hand on Violet's abdomen. I can feel it turning. The physician was correct. It has repositioned itself. The child heard me talking to you, Violet said with a smile. It understood that its father was terrified, and it chose to show mercy. I do not deserve mercy, Julian replied. No, Violet agreed, but you have it anyway because love is not about deserving. Love is about choosing to remain present despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, despite the absolute knowledge that terrible things are possible. Julian settled his head against her belly, his arms wrapped around her expanding form, and Violet felt something fundamental shift in their relationship. The fear remained, but it no longer dominated. They had survived the trial of his overwhelming anxiety, and in surviving it, they had arrived at a deeper understanding of what genuine partnership required. April arrived with the kind of weather that seemed to acknowledge that winter, finally, was truly ending. The snow melted. The gardens at Asherstone House began to show evidence of life returning, and Violet's body, after months of carrying the pregnancy, began to prepare for the extraordinary work of delivery. I am ready, she said to Julian one morning in early April. My body is ready, my mind is ready. I am prepared for this child to enter the world. The labor began on April 15th, a Tuesday morning, with the kind of gradual onset that suggested her body had learned from observation that there was no need for dramatic urgency. The contractions began as manageable sensations, and Violet moved through her morning with deliberate intention, preparing breakfast, attending to correspondence, doing everything within her power to remain normal and present. By afternoon, the contractions had established a pattern that could no longer be ignored. By evening, they were occurring with enough frequency and intensity that the physician was summoned. This is normal progression, the physician said after his examination. The labor may extend into the night or it may progress more quickly. The child is positioned correctly. Everything appears to be progressing as it should. Julian, having learned from his earlier obsessive behavior, attempted to remain present without attempting to control. He sat beside Violet's bed and simply existed with her, holding her hand during contractions, offering water and encouragement, remaining steady while she moved through increasing pain. "Thank you," she said between contractions, "for allowing me to do this without attempting to prevent it or minimize it or fix it. Thank you for simply being present." "Where else would I be?" Julian replied. "This is the most significant event of our lives. I would not be anywhere other than here." The labor extended through the night, and Violet discovered that her years of invisible service had actually prepared her for childbirth. She had learned to endure, to remain composed under pressure, to persist through difficulty. She applied those learned skills to the extraordinary work of pushing another human being into existence. By dawn on April 16th, with the first light creeping through the windows of her bedchamber, the child came into the world with a cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of Ashestone House. "A daughter," the midwife said, her expression transformed into something approaching joy. "You have a daughter, Your Grace. Extraordinarily healthy, beautiful, precisely perfect." Julian, who had been permitted to remain in the room despite the impropriety, went absolutely still. The child was placed on Violet's chest, still wet from the journey through the birth canal, still confused by the transition from womb to world, still fundamentally extraordinary in her simple existence. "We have a daughter," Violet whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "We have created a daughter." Julian moved to his wife and child with the reverence of a man approaching something sacred. His hand trembled as he touched his daughter's impossibly small fingers. "She is remarkable," he said. "She is absolutely remarkable." "She is ours," Violet replied. "She is the result of our love, our choice, our absolute commitment to creating something genuine from the wreckage of our individual histories." It took considerable time before the child was cleaned and wrapped in soft blankets. It took even longer before the household understood that the Duchess had delivered successfully and the child was healthy. But eventually, word spread through Ashestone House and into the surrounding community that the Duke and Duchess of Ashestone had been blessed with a daughter. The name selection occurred that evening, after Violet had rested and recovered sufficient strength to participate in the decision. "I wish to name her Eleanor," Violet said. "Eleanor Margaret Whitmore Ravencroft. After the strength of women who transform their own circumstances, after my mother Margaret, who sacrificed everything for my education and independence, and after the Ravencroft name that your family has carried for generations." "Eleanor Margaret," Julian repeated, testing the name as though it were sacred. "Our daughter, Eleanor Margaret Ravencroft, future Duchess of Ashestone if she wishes it, woman of consequence and power if she chooses it." He bent down and pressed a kiss to his daughter's forehead, with such tenderness that Violet felt fresh tears slide down her cheeks. "I love you," he said to Eleanor Margaret, and then to Violet. "I love you both completely. I love the fact that we have created this extraordinary child together. I love the fact that she will grow up surrounded by genuine love rather than social obligation. She will know," Violet said, "that her father is a man capable of transformation, that her mother is a woman capable of choosing visibility despite the cost, that love is not about perfection, but about the daily choice to be present and devoted and absolutely committed to honoring the person before you." By the following morning, Ashestone House had settled into the rhythm of a new infant's presence. Eleanor Margaret demanded feeding with surprising frequency and intensity. She slept in intervals that seemed inversely related to Julian and Violet's need for rest, and she transformed the household with the simple fact of her existence. The servants, who had treated Violet with respect born of obligation, suddenly treated her with respect born of genuine recognition. She had done what society most valued. She had produced an heir. That she had produced a daughter rather than a son was initially viewed as a complication, but Violet addressed this potential disappointment with characteristic directness. "Our daughter," she said to the assembled household staff, "will inherit this estate and this title, and she will govern it with as much wisdom and capability as any son could provide. Anyone who believes otherwise will find themselves seeking employment elsewhere." By April's end, Eleanor Margaret had settled into a pattern that suggested she was a remarkably good-natured child. She had her father's dark hair and what appeared to be her mother's observant eyes. She slept when appropriate, ate with enthusiasm, and seemed determined to become a person of considerable consequence. On Eleanor Margaret's 1-month birthday, Julian took Violet to the conservatory, the room where so many significant moments of their relationship had occurred. "I want to thank you," he said, "for everything you have given me, for seeing me when I was broken, for choosing to remain visible despite the extraordinary cost that visibility required." For creating this daughter who represents the future that I did not believe was possible. I want to thank you, Violet replied, for allowing me to escape invisibility, for treating my intelligence and my capacity as valuable, for creating a family in which I am not a servant but a partner, for loving our daughter with the same devotion that you have shown me. They stood together, observing their daughter as Margaret held her near the window where afternoon light created an almost ethereal atmosphere. She will have opportunities that neither of us had, Violet said. She will be educated. She will be cherished. She will understand that her value is not contingent on her beauty or her marriage ability, but on her character and her capability. She will change the world, Julian replied, because she will be raised by a mother who already has. 1 year had passed since Eleanor Margaret's arrival into the world. It was a day of remarkable ordinariness in most respects. The spring sun was warm, the gardens were blooming, the household moved through its daily routines with the efficiency that Asherstone House now represented. But it was also a day of profound significance, a day that marked not an ending, but rather a fundamental transformation in what was possible. Eleanor Margaret was 1 year old, and she was extraordinary in every respect that mattered. She had learned to sit, to babble in sounds that suggested she understood that communication was possible, to observe the world with an intensity that suggested she was cataloguing everything for future reference. She had her father's penetrating gaze and her mother's quiet intensity. She had inherited from both her parents the capacity to change the trajectory of everyone around her, simply through the force of her presence. Violet, standing in the nursery and observing her daughter attempt to grasp a sunbeam that streamed through the window, felt a peace that transcended anything she had experienced in her prior life. This was not the peace of invisibility. That had been the peace of non-existence. This was the peace of genuine belonging, of constructing a life deliberately rather than having one imposed upon her. "She is remarkable," Julian said, appearing in the doorway with his characteristic silent arrival. He had a habit of observing his daughter without her awareness, as though afraid that any interruption might disturb some essential magic. "She is herself," Violet replied, "and that is the greatest gift we can give her, the freedom to become whoever she chooses to be, unburdened by our expectations or society's limitations." Eleanor Margaret noticed her father's presence and turned with the kind of recognition that suggested she understood, on some fundamental level, that he was important. She made a sound of genuine joy, and Julian's entire face transformed. "She knows me," he said with a wonder that suggested he still found it remarkable that his daughter recognized his existence. "She knows that you are the person who holds her when she is afraid," Violet replied. "She knows that you are the person who speaks to her with extraordinary tenderness. She knows that you love her completely. That knowledge transcends age or understanding. It is something she has absorbed directly." Julian moved to Eleanor Margaret and lifted her with the careful certainty of a man who had become accustomed to handling something precious. She settled against his chest, her tiny head resting against his shoulder, her fingers reaching up to grab at his cravat with the single-minded intention of an infant. "I have been thinking," Julian said, "about what you said when Eleanor Margaret was born, about how she will have opportunities that neither of us had. I have been considering how to ensure that reality." "What do you propose?" Violet asked. "I propose," Julian said slowly, "that we establish a trust specifically for Eleanor Margaret's education. Not simply the education that a young lady of her station receives, but genuine education. Access to tutors in mathematics, natural philosophy, languages, anything that her mind wishes to explore. I propose that we ensure she has choices that most women in her position never possess." "That is remarkable," Violet said, "but what will society say about a duke who educates his daughter as though she were a son?" "Society," Julian replied with visible disdain, "will say precisely what society always says. They will judge, they will disapprove. And then when Eleanor Margaret becomes the woman who understands natural philosophy more thoroughly than the men around her, or who speaks 5 languages fluently, or who demonstrates intelligence that transcends the narrow confines of accomplishments for ladies, society will adjust their expectations. They always do eventually when confronted with evidence that their prejudices are simply that, prejudices rather than truth." Violet smiled, and in that smile existed a conversation about how much they had both transformed since that rainy October day in Bath, when Julian had entered her shop with a torn coat and a desperate need to become invisible. "I have something to show you," she said, moving to a drawer where she had been keeping Eleanor Margaret's future. She withdrew the letter she had written during her pregnancy, the letter that would one day be given to her daughter to read. Julian opened it carefully and read the words that Violet had written from the depths of her pregnancy. My dearest Eleanor, you were created from love, not from obligation or necessity, but from the genuine affection of two people who chose each other. Absolutely. Your father was a man who had been convinced of his own unworthiness. Your mother was a woman who had been forced into invisibility. Together we created you, a symbol of our transformation, a representation of what becomes possible when two broken people decide to love each other completely. I want you to know that my journey from invisibility to visibility was not a triumph because of any inherent superiority. It was a triumph because I chose to value myself, to recognize my own capability, and to refuse to accept the limitations that society attempted to impose. You will face limitations. You will encounter people who believe that your value is determined by whether you can secure an advantageous marriage, bear children, maintain a household. You will encounter people who believe that your intelligence is less valuable than your beauty, your opinion less significant than your compliance. Do not believe them. You possess the capacity to become anything you choose. You possess the ability to transform not only your own circumstances, but the circumstances of everyone around you. You are not obligated to follow any particular path simply because it is traditional. Live visibly, live deliberately, live completely, and know always that you were wanted, valued, and loved before you were even born. Your mother, Julian, handed the letter back to Violet with tears sliding down his face. That is the most valuable thing in this house, he said. More valuable than any painting or jewelry or land. That letter represents everything that we have fought to achieve. The creation of a world in which our daughter will be known and valued for who she is, rather than what society expects her to be. That evening, as the sun set over the Asherstone estate and painted the gardens in shades of amber and rose, Julian and Violet stood together, with Eleanor Margaret between them. The child, tired from a day of remarkable living, drowsed against her father's chest while Violet's hand rested on both her husband and her daughter. Do you ever regret it? Julian asked quietly. Do you ever regret abandoning your small, safe existence in Bath to become a duchess? Not for a single moment, Violet replied. I regret nothing except the years I spent invisible. I regret nothing about choosing visibility, choosing you, choosing to construct a life that is genuinely mine, rather than simply a life imposed upon me. I regret nothing except the years I spent believing that I was incapable of transformation, Julian said. I regret nothing about choosing you, choosing Eleanor Margaret, choosing to use my power in service of something other than perpetuating my own comfort. Eleanor Margaret, sensing that something significant was occurring even in her drowsy state, opened her eyes and looked at both her parents with an expression of solemn consideration. Then she smiled, a genuine, toothless smile that contained no performance and no reservation. In that moment, standing in the Asherstone gardens with their daughter between them, Julian and Violet understood something that transcended words. They had done what they had set out to do. They had taken the wreckage of their individual histories and constructed something approaching grace. They had created not only a child, but an entire world in which love was genuine, and visibility was chosen, and transformation was possible. The sun continued its descent. The gardens darkened gradually, and Asherstone House, once a monument to aristocratic tradition and social expectation, became something far more revolutionary. A place where genuine love was the foundation, where women's voices were heard and valued, where a child would grow up understanding that her worth was not determined by society's judgment, but by the simple fact of being deeply loved. It was a house transformed, and in that transformation existed the possibility that the entire world might one day be transformed as well. Eleanor Margaret was 2 years old, and she had become something approaching legendary in the circles of London society. She was not legendary because of her title or her parents' position, though those things certainly contributed to her visibility. She was legendary because she was quite simply extraordinary, a child who demonstrated intelligence that transcended her age, observational capability that suggested she understood far more than she should, and a personality so compelling that even the most hardened members of society found themselves unable to resist her charm. "The child is remarkable," the Marchioness of Pemberton said one afternoon, observing Eleanor Margaret as she moved through the drawing room with the kind of confidence that suggested she understood perfectly well that she was the most important person present. "I must confess that I did not anticipate such a result from the Duke's marriage to that woman." "That woman," Violet's mother replied sharply, happens to be the Duchess of Asheston and the mother of a child who will likely accomplish more in her lifetime than you have accomplished in yours. I would suggest that you adjust your language accordingly. Margaret Chen had within the past year taken residence at Ashestone House. The decision had been made gradually. Violet had invited her mother to assist with Eleanor Margaret's care, and Margaret had discovered that she was extraordinarily skilled at managing infants. She had also discovered that remaining in London, surrounded by her daughter's newfound influence, was considerably more satisfying than maintaining a small dressmaking establishment in Bath. She had become quite naturally the Duchess mother, a position that carried weight beyond what her biological relationship to the family might suggest. She held opinions about how Eleanor Margaret should be raised. She influenced decisions about the child's education, and most significantly, she had become the person to whom Violet turned when she required counsel about matters that transcended what Julian could provide. "Your mother is formidable," Julian observed one evening, as Margaret supervised Eleanor Margaret's bedtime preparations with the kind of methodical precision that suggested she had transformed infant care into an exact science. "She is," Violet agreed. "She spent her entire life being invisible in this society, and now that she no longer needs to be invisible, she is making up for lost time." Eleanor Margaret had begun to speak with remarkable clarity for her age. She did not simply babble. She articulated actual words with correct pronunciation, and most remarkably with comprehension of their meaning. She understood that Mama indicated one particular person and Papa indicated another. She understood that no was a word of power that her parents generally respected. By 2 years and 3 months, she was speaking in short sentences. By 2 years and 6 months, she was asking questions about everything that surrounded her, questions that suggested a mind already engaged in the fundamental work of understanding how the world functioned. "What is that?" she would ask, pointing at a painting. "Why?" she would demand when told to do something she found illogical. "But why?" she would persist when the first answer failed to satisfy. Society, which had been prepared to judge the child as a product of her inappropriate mother, instead found itself charmed. Observations about Eleanor Margaret became observations about how remarkable she is for her age, and what an extraordinary child the Duchess has produced, and most significantly, the Duke was clearly correct in his choice of wife. The reversal of society's judgment was not sudden or complete, but it was unmistakable. Invitations multiplied. Requests for Eleanor Margaret to attend various events increased, and gradually, imperceptibly, Violet transformed from the woman who had married above her station into the woman who had married correctly, who had made an excellent choice, who had demonstrated the kind of intelligence that society had not believed her to possess. "Do you find this satisfying?" Julian asked one afternoon, observing Violet as she navigated a garden party with the confidence of someone who understood that her position was secure. "Do you find satisfaction in society's eventual recognition of what I recognized immediately?" "Not satisfaction," Violet replied. "Understanding. I understand now that society's judgment was never actually about me. It was about their own fear of transformation. Once they observed that Eleanor Margaret was extraordinary, they could reframe their understanding of me. I was not a woman who had seduced a vulnerable man, but a woman who had borne an extraordinary child. I was not an inappropriate choice, but a woman of hidden qualities." "Your daughter," Eleanor Margaret's great-grandmother Margaret Chen interjected, having overheard the conversation, "has shown them something they were not prepared to observe, that worth is not determined by birth. That a child born to a seamstress can be as intelligent, as charming, as valuable as any child born to aristocracy." By Eleanor Margaret's second birthday celebration, which occurred in April, and which was attended by more than 200 people, including members of Parliament and several minor royals, Violet had become something approaching accepted, not universally, and not without the persistent undercurrent of judgment that would never entirely disappear, but accepted in the way that society accepts those who refuse to apologize for their existence. Eleanor Margaret's birthday celebration was, of necessity, an extraordinarily sophisticated affair. She could not, as an ordinary child might be, simply play with toys in the nursery while adults drank champagne and congratulated themselves on their generosity. She was the future Duchess of Ashestone. She was the symbol of the Duke's successful marriage. She was, whether she understood it or not, a statement about what was possible when rigid social structures encountered genuine love and determination. "She is 2 years old," one observer remarked, watching Eleanor Margaret discuss the color of the decorations with the kind of seriousness that suggested she was engaging in diplomatic negotiation. And she is already more politically astute than half the men in Parliament. By the end of Eleanor Margaret's second year, two significant developments had occurred. The first was that Violet had become, unquestionably, a respected member of London society, not accepted despite her background, but accepted because society had been forced to recognize that her background had somehow produced a remarkable woman. The second was that Violet had discovered, quite by accident, that she was pregnant again. "I was not aware," she said to Julian, somewhat bewildered by the speed with which she had conceived, "that I was capable of becoming pregnant immediately after Eleanor Margaret's birth. I had assumed that my body would require considerably more recovery time." "My wife," Julian replied with a smile that suggested he found the situation amusing, "apparently possesses a remarkable capacity for biological productivity. Are you well? Are you pleased by this development?" "I am pleased," Violet confirmed. "I am also somewhat terrified, as the complications that occurred with Eleanor Margaret's pregnancy have not entirely faded from my memory. But yes, I am pleased. I wish for Eleanor Margaret to have a sibling. I wish for our family to expand." "This time," Julian said with absolute certainty, "the pregnancy will be uncomplicated, because we have already survived the worst complications that nature can impose. And because you are a woman of extraordinary resilience." But Julian, despite his confidence, proved to be incorrect about the nature of complication that the second pregnancy would create. By October of the year following Eleanor Margaret's second birthday, Violet's second pregnancy was progressing with remarkable smoothness. There were no posterior presentations, no complications with positioning, no medical crises that might have justified the anxiety that Julian seemed determined to maintain. Instead, the complications were entirely social and intellectual. "I have been thinking," Violet said to Julian one afternoon as she sat in the library, the room that had become her sanctum, "about what Eleanor Margaret will require for her education. And I have come to a conclusion that I suspect you will find politically problematic." "Express your conclusion," Julian replied, settling into the chair across from her, with the kind of attentiveness that suggested he took her thoughts seriously, regardless of whether he agreed with them. "I wish to establish a school," Violet said, "a school specifically for girls of all social classes, not a school designed to teach girls how to be accomplished wives, but a genuine school. Mathematics, natural philosophy, languages, history, art, music, all taught to the same rigorous standard that boys receive at Eton." Julian was silent for a long moment. Then he began to smile. "That is the most radical proposal I have heard in years," he said. "That is also the most brilliant proposal I have heard in years." "You are not going to tell me that it is impossible?" Violet asked, surprised by his ready acceptance. "I am not," Julian replied. "I am going to tell you that it is exactly the kind of project that society will find objectionable and that will eventually prove to be extraordinarily transformative. I am going to tell you that I will allocate whatever resources are necessary to make it a reality. Society will say that I am attempting to elevate girls beyond their natural station," Violet said. "They will say that education will make them unsuitable for marriage." "Society will say many things," Julian agreed. "Society will eventually accept what you are proposing, because they will observe that the girls educated in your school become women of such capability that they are extraordinarily desirable, that they bring intelligence and wisdom to whatever position they occupy, whether that is marriage or professional endeavor." By November, plans for the school were underway. Violet selected a property approximately 5 miles from Asherstone House, a building that had previously served as a country estate, and which could be adapted to serve educational purposes. She began to recruit instructors, women of genuine learning who had been constrained by society's limitations and who recognized in Violet's proposal an opportunity to exercise their intellect in service of education. "You understand," one prospective instructor said, "a woman named Miss Eleanor Hartwell, who possessed a doctorate from an unaccredited university and who had spent 15 years tutoring wealthy families' daughters in mathematics, that this will be considered scandalous, that you may face significant social repercussions." "I have already faced significant social repercussions," Violet replied. "I married a duke while working as a seamstress. I bore a daughter who is more intelligent than most members of Parliament. I am now establishing an institution designed to ensure that girls are educated according to their capability rather than their gender. Additional scandal seems almost redundant at this point." By December, the school, which would be called the Asherstone Academy for Young Women, was operational in limited capacity. Violet had invited 15 girls of varying social classes to participate in its inaugural term. Eleanor Margaret, at 3 years old, was permitted to observe certain lessons, sitting quietly beside her mother and absorbing knowledge through simple exposure. "Your daughter," Miss Hartwell observed, watching Eleanor Margaret listen to a lesson on natural philosophy with absolute concentration, "is absorbing information at a rate that suggests her mind is exceptionally advanced." "She is," Violet agreed. "But she is also 3 years old, and she requires play and imagination and the simple joy of being a child. I do not wish to accelerate her development at the expense of her childhood." "That," Miss Hartwell said, "is wisdom that most of society would find incomprehensible. Most parents with a gifted child would push that child to perform, to demonstrate capability. You are instead insisting that she have the opportunity to develop at her own pace." By the time Violet's second pregnancy entered its final months, the Asherstone Academy had become the source of considerable discussion in society. Some of the commentary was positive, progressive individuals who recognized in the school an opportunity for genuine social transformation. But much of the commentary was negative, traditionalists who viewed the school as a threat to the natural order of society. "Your wife," one member of Parliament said to Julian, "is engaged in genuinely revolutionary work. She is, perhaps without full awareness of what she is doing, dismantling the entire structure that maintains social stability." "My wife," Julian replied, "is educating girls. That you view education as revolutionary says considerably more about the limitations of your thinking than about any revolutionary intentions on her part." By February, as Violet's second pregnancy approached its conclusion, the Asherstone Academy had expanded to 40 students, with plans for considerable additional growth in the following year. Letters arrived from families requesting admission for their daughters. Instructors applied from across the country, individuals who recognized in Violet's vision an opportunity to exercise their intellect in service of something larger than themselves. And Eleanor Margaret, now 3 years and 10 months old, had become something approaching an ambassador for the school, a visible representation that education did not diminish a child, but rather enhanced her capability to move through the world with intelligence and purpose. "She is remarkable," society said, and this time the word was applied both to Eleanor Margaret and to the educational initiative that her mother had created. The labor with the second child began in early March, with such sudden intensity that it seemed to confirm Julian's persistent anxiety about complications. Violet was approximately 1 week away from her anticipated delivery date when the contractions began with a force that suggested the child was not willing to wait for medical convenience. "The child is eager," the midwife observed, after examining Violet and confirming that labor was progressing with remarkable speed. "This one intends to arrive with considerably more urgency than the first." Julian, having learned from his obsessive anxiety during Eleanor Margaret's pregnancy, attempted to remain calm. He attempted to sit beside Violet and offer support without attempting to control. But beneath his careful composure existed the same underlying fear that had consumed him before, fear that something might go wrong, fear that he might lose her, fear that the extraordinary life they had constructed might be destroyed by circumstance beyond his control. "Stop that," Violet said sharply between contractions. "Stop allowing your fear to dominate. Be present, be supportive, but do not allow catastrophe to be your primary focus." By afternoon, the child had progressed far enough that the physician predicted delivery within hours. Eleanor Margaret, sensing that something significant was occurring, had been taken to stay with her great-grandmother, Margaret Chen, freeing Violet to focus entirely on the work of childbirth. And it was work. Extraordinary, exhausting, all-consuming work that required every element of Violet's physical and mental capacity. She moved through the labor with the kind of methodical intensity that suggested she understood that this was not something that could be avoided or minimized. It was something that could only be endured and ultimately transcended. By late afternoon, as the sun began its descent, the second child arrived with considerably less fanfare than Eleanor Margaret had required. The midwife caught the child with practiced efficiency and immediately announced, "A son, Your Grace. You have a son." Julian went absolutely still. The entire trajectory of his family's future had just shifted. The question of succession, which had previously depended on Eleanor Margaret's willingness to inherit or marry strategically, was now answered by the simple biological fact of a male heir. "A son," Violet whispered, her voice hoarse from the effort of labor. "We have a son." The child was placed on her chest, and Violet observed him with an intensity that suggested she was cataloguing every detail of his appearance for permanent memory. He had his mother's dark hair and what appeared to be his father's angular face structure. He was remarkably alert for a newborn, his eyes open and observing the world with a curiosity that suggested he was determined to understand everything immediately. "He is perfect," Julian said, his voice breaking. "He is absolutely perfect." "We will name him Charles," Violet said. "Charles Julian Whitmore Ravencroft, after your grandfather, after your father, after yourself. He will inherit your title, but I suspect he will inherit considerably more. He will inherit the understanding that privilege brings responsibility, that power should be exercised in service of something larger than oneself. That transformation is always possible, regardless of one's history." The naming of the child as Charles was significant, not only because it connected him to family tradition, but because it represented Violet's understanding that while Eleanor Margaret might represent the future in terms of gender equality and educational transformation, Charles represented something equally important: the possibility that men raised with genuine values might become men capable of exercising power with wisdom and compassion. By the following morning, Charles had settled into the rhythm of newborn existence, demanding feeding, sleeping intermittently, communicating primarily through crying. The household adjusted with the fluidity of an institution that had already experienced the arrival of one extraordinary child and understood that children required accommodation rather than accommodation being required of them. Eleanor Margaret, brought back to meet her brother, observed Charles with the kind of solemn evaluation that suggested she was assessing his worthiness as a sibling. She reached out with one small finger and touched his face with surprising gentleness. "Brother," she said, as though declaring something of profound importance. "Charles, brother." "Yes," Violet confirmed. "Charles is your brother. You will teach him everything you have learned. You will protect him. You will ensure that he understands that women possess the same capability as men, the same value, the same right to determine their own existence." "I will," Eleanor Margaret promised with the kind of seriousness that suggested she understood, on some fundamental level, that she had been entrusted with something of considerable importance. By March's end, Charles had settled into the household with a kind of ease that suggested he had always been intended to arrive precisely when he did. The Asherstone Academy continued its expansion, now with the additional benefit of visible proof that education for girls did not interfere with women's capacity to produce male heirs, a fact that seemed to satisfy society's underlying anxiety about Violet's educational experiment. "Society will accept almost anything," Julian observed, watching Eleanor Margaret play with her brother while Violet observed from nearby, "provided that you continue to produce male heirs and maintain the appearance of traditional family structure." "Then we shall maintain that appearance," Violet replied, while simultaneously dismantling every underlying assumption that makes that structure necessary. By the time Charles and Eleanor Margaret reach adulthood, society's understanding of what is possible will have transformed entirely. 2 years had passed since Charles's arrival, and the Asherstone Academy for Young Women had expanded far beyond what Violet had initially anticipated. There were now 120 students in residence, attending from families across England. The success of the academy had inspired similar institutions to begin establishing themselves in other counties, institutions that explicitly credited Violet's pioneering work as their inspiration. "You have created a movement," Miss Eleanor Hartwell observed one afternoon, as she and Violet reviewed applications for the upcoming academic term. "You intended to educate girls. Instead, you have fundamentally transformed society's understanding of what education for women could be." Eleanor Margaret was now 5 years old, and she had become something approaching a symbol of the Academy's success, a visible representation that girls educated according to their capability rather than their gender developed into women of extraordinary intelligence and capability. She had begun to assist her mother in some of the Academy's administrative functions, not in any formal capacity, but simply by being present and asking the kinds of questions that forced adults to examine their assumptions. "Why do the older girls study philosophy?" she had asked recently, upon observing a lesson on ethics. "If philosophy is about understanding truth, should we not all study it?" "Because," one of the traditionalist observers had replied, "it is not considered appropriate for young ladies to engage in abstract thought." "But why?" Eleanor Margaret had persisted. with the kind of relentless logic that seemed to run in her mother's line. If abstract thought is simply thinking in a particular manner, why would it be inappropriate for girls to think that way? No one had been able to provide a satisfactory answer, which had suggested, more clearly than any philosophical argument could have, that the restriction was arbitrary rather than based on any actual limitation. By Eleanor Margaret's 5th birthday, which coincided approximately with Charles's 2nd, the transformation of the Asherstone estate had become comprehensive. The improvements in housing for tenants had been completed. The village school had been expanded. The medical care available to the estate's inhabitants had been modernized. And the Asherstone Academy had become not simply a local institution, but a national one. "I want to show you something," Julian said to Violet one afternoon in May, as they walked through the grounds of Asherstone House. Eleanor, Margaret and Charles were being supervised by their great-grandmother, allowing Violet and Julian rare moments alone. He led her to the library, the room where so many significant moments of their relationship had occurred. But the library had changed. The walls, previously lined entirely with books that had belonged to generations of dukes, now included a dedicated section that was entirely new. It was a section that contained first editions of works by female philosophers, mathematicians and natural scientists. It contained biographies of women who had achieved significance despite social limitations. It contained primary source documents from the Asherstone Academy. "I have created a permanent collection," Julian explained, "documenting the transformation that you have initiated. Not simply the educational transformation, but the social, political and intellectual transformation that your presence and your vision have created. I want Eleanor, Margaret and Charles to understand, when they are old enough to understand fully, exactly what their mother has accomplished." "I have not accomplished anything," Violet protested. "I have simply done what seemed necessary." "That," Julian replied, "is precisely what makes your accomplishment so remarkable. You did not set out to transform society. You simply chose to be visible. You chose to love despite the cost. You chose to use whatever power you acquired through marriage not for self-aggrandizement, but for genuine social benefit. And in making those choices, you have transformed everything." The letter that Julia had written to Eleanor Margaret during her pregnancy, the letter about visibility and choosing one's own path, had been supplemented by another letter, written by Julian, that documented precisely what he had observed as his wife transformed from invisible seamstress to revolutionary educator. "My dearest Eleanor, your mother will likely not tell you this, so I must. When I first encountered her in Bath, she was a woman so completely committed to remaining invisible that I initially did not recognize how remarkable she was. But as I came to know her, I began to understand that her invisibility was not genuine, but rather a choice, a strategy for survival in a world that had not given her permission to exist visibly. When you were born, your mother made a different choice. She chose visibility. She chose to claim space in a world that did not believe she deserved it. And in making that choice, she did something that I can only describe as revolutionary. She transformed not only her own existence, but the existence of every girl who will attend the Asherstone Academy. You will inherit my title. Your brother Charles will likely inherit the dukedom. But you both will inherit something far more valuable. You will inherit your mother's understanding that transformation is always possible, that visibility is a choice, and that power is only valuable if it is exercised in service of something larger than oneself. I am proud of your mother. I am proud to be her husband, and I am extraordinarily proud to be your father." Your father. By the time Eleanor Margaret was 5 and Charles was 2, the Asherstone family had become something approaching a paradigm of transformation. Society still harbored reservations about Violet's educational experiment, but those reservations had become increasingly muted by the observable reality that the Asherstone Academy was producing educated, capable young women who enhanced rather than diminished the society they inhabited. "I want a third child," Violet announced one evening, with the kind of directness that had become characteristic of her throughout her life. Julian, who had not anticipated this declaration, set down his port-glass with care. "You are certain?" he asked. "I am certain," Violet replied. "We have Eleanor Margaret, who represents the future of women's capability. We have Charles, who represents the possibility that men can be raised to value that capability. I wish to have one more child. A final representation that family, as we have constructed it, is capable of containing both continuation and transformation simultaneously. Then we shall have another child," Julian said with absolute certainty, "and that child, whether son or daughter, will be raised in a world that their mother has fundamentally altered through her presence and her vision. By late autumn of that year, Violet had discovered that she was pregnant for the third time. The pregnancy was, in every respect, uncomplicated. The pregnancy of a woman whose body had proven itself capable and whose mind had achieved the kind of peace that comes from understanding that one's life has meaning beyond one's own survival. "I am grateful," she said to Julian one evening, her hand on her abdomen where the third child was moving with increasing frequency, "for every decision that brought me to this moment. I am grateful for the poverty that taught me resilience. I am grateful for the invisibility that taught me to value genuine seeing. I am grateful for the journey that brought me from your shop in Bath to this place where I am constructing a legacy that will outlast both of us." "You are remarkable," Julian replied, taking her hand and placing it back on her abdomen alongside his own. "And I have spent every day since meeting you recognizing that reality." "We are both remarkable," Violet corrected gently, "because we were both willing to be transformed. We were both willing to acknowledge our brokenness and to build something genuine from it. That capacity for transformation, that is what Eleanor, Margaret and Charles and this third child will inherit. Not titles or wealth, but the understanding that we are never imprisoned by our history, that visibility is a choice, and that love, genuine love, makes transformation not simply possible, but inevitable." The Asherstone Academy for Young Women had now been in operation for 7 years. It had expanded from its initial 15 students to more than 250 students in residence at any given time, with an additional 100 or more attending day sessions. The success of the Academy had inspired the establishment of similar institutions across England, institutions that explicitly credited Violet's pioneering work as their foundation. Eleanor Margaret was now 10 years old, and she was extraordinary in every respect that mattered. She was intellectually advanced, reading natural philosophy texts that most university students had not encountered. She was socially accomplished, moving through society with the confidence of someone who understood that her value was not contingent on her compliance with arbitrary social expectations. But most significantly, she was kind, possessing the kind of genuine compassion that transcended intellectual capability. Charles was 7, and he had developed into a child who seemed to understand from the earliest age that he possessed privilege and responsibility in equal measure. He studied alongside the girls at the academy, a development that had initially scandalized society, but which had gradually become accepted as simply the way that the Asherstone family conducted their affairs. Margaret Eleanor, named after both her great-grandmother and her older sister, was 4 years old and already demonstrating the kind of intellectual precocity that suggested she would exceed even Eleanor Margaret's early achievements. She had been born during a spring thunderstorm, as though the weather itself was celebrating the arrival of another child into this extraordinary family. Violet stood in the Asherstone Academy's main hall on a spring afternoon, observing the students as they moved through their lessons. She was no longer young. She had passed her 40th year, and the years of work had marked her with lines of concentration around her eyes and a kind of gravity that came from understanding that one's work carried weight. "Your achievement is remarkable," the Marchioness of Pemberton said, appearing at Violet's side. This was the same woman who had made the comment about allowing such a woman to represent the dignity of an ancient dukedom years earlier. She had not exactly transformed into an enthusiastic supporter, but she had gradually come to acknowledge Violet's capabilities as undeniable. "You have created something that will outlast all of us." "I have created a school," Violet replied simply. "My daughter will create something far more significant than that. And her daughter, if she chooses to have one, will create something even more transformative." That is how genuine social change occurs. It does not happen in dramatic moments of revelation. It happens incrementally, generation by generation, through individuals choosing to be visible and to use whatever power they possess in service of something larger than themselves. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Julian observed his wife with an expression that had not changed in the years since they had met, an expression of absolute recognition of her value, absolute commitment to supporting her vision, absolute love for the woman she had become. Eleanor Margaret, seated across from her mother, was reviewing academy applications with the seriousness of someone who understood that educational opportunity was life-changing. Charles was asking questions about the natural philosophy lesson he had attended that morning, questions that suggested his mind was engaged in the fundamental work of understanding how the world functioned. Margaret Eleanor, at 4 years old, was creating complicated narratives about imaginary situations with the kind of elaborate storytelling that suggested her mind was already engaged in the work of transforming reality through imagination. "What are you thinking?" Julian asked Violet quietly as they watched their children. "I am thinking," Violet replied, "about the seamstress who worked in this house 5 years before she met you. I'm thinking about how invisible that woman was, how constrained her existence had been, how little freedom she had possessed. And I'm thinking about how profoundly everything has transformed." "You have transformed everything," Julian corrected gently. "No," Violet said with the honesty that had always characterized her. "We have transformed everything, together, because you were willing to see me when the entire world was determined to overlook me, because you were willing to acknowledge your own brokenness and to build something genuine from it, because you understood that love, real love, is not about maintaining social structures, but about creating spaces where transformation becomes possible." She took his hand. And in that gesture existed an entire conversation about the extraordinary journey that had brought them from that October afternoon in Bath to this place where they had constructed not simply a family, but an institution that would alter the trajectory of English society. The Asherstone Academy would continue to grow. Eleanor Margaret would eventually assume leadership of the institution, expanding it further than her mother had imagined possible. Charles would inherit the dukedom and would use his position to advocate for educational reform and gender equality in ways that would make him eventually one of the most progressive dukes in English history. Margaret Eleanor would become a scholar and educator in her own right, publishing works on pedagogy that would influence educational philosophy for generations. But in this moment, on this spring evening gathered around the dinner table at Asherstone House, the family that had been constructed from brokenness and determination and genuine love simply existed together, not as perfect people, not as people without flaws or concerns or future challenges, but as people who had learned to see each other truly and to love each other completely. The invisible seamstress had become the Duchess of Asherstone. The broken widower had become a man of genuine purpose, and together they had created something approaching grace, not through grand gestures or revolutionary proclamations, but through the quiet, persistent choice, day after day, to be visible, to be honest, to be devoted to something larger than themselves. That, perhaps, was the greatest revolution of all. Thank you for spending nearly 2 hours with Eleanor and Julian, a love story that transformed an entire society. If this tale of redemption, courage, and quiet revolution moved your heart, please share it with someone who still believes that love can bloom in the most unexpected places. Subscribe to our channel for more historical romances that celebrate the strength of women and the transformation that genuine love makes possible. Comment below. Which moment in Eleanor and Julian's journey touched you the most? Your thoughts help us create more stories of healing, visibility, and second chances. From all of us at Victorian Romance Audio Stories, thank you for being part of Eleanor's journey.